of the handful of nonprofits who focus very specifically on legal issues, but there aren't a lot of those. We also found that a large proportion of job adverts from the same organizations were relating to these sorts of roles, which provides some evidence that nonprofits actually struggle to hire relevant, highly capable and well-qualified staff in this area. But again, we didn't separate government and other types of legal roles. We've also just completed a survey of a similar group of nonprofits, and that category, again, government, policy, lobbying or legal, had the third highest score in terms of the respondents saying that that was a difficult area to hire staff for from the 10 different categories that we asked about. And we've also done another survey where we've asked a group of researchers and experts about the effective animal advocacy movement. When we asked them what proportion of people hoping to help animals they think should focus their careers on what we called related legal work, for example, animal welfare law, the average answer given was 8%. So for me, just reading off some of those numbers there, I guess one key takeaway is that there aren't necessarily lots of roles as a proportion of the overall movement in non-profits currently doing legal work. But on the other hand, it might be quite hard to hire high quality staff with relevant expertise. If you consider that an organization of around 100 staff might have only 1 or 2 legal experts, it's really important that those experts are really highly capable and understand the needs of the organization, and they could have a really important role to play. Of course, lawyers might be able to pivot into other parts in nonprofits like lobbying roles and operations roles. But yeah, I guess I'm also excited to see it from some of the other speakers, what they talk about. And in terms of considering other types of roles that lawyers can do that help animals in ways that aren't necessarily working directly in nonprofits. Help animals really effectively is, to the extent that lawyers are actually a relatively well-paid profession, then lawyers who don't work in the non-profit sector, for example, might be able to donate some of their earnings to effective animal advocacy non-profits and do a lot of good in that way. Some of our research has shown that funding is one of the main constraints that the movement actually faces. So that's a really valuable contribution. Another example would be volunteering time and doing pro bono legal advice, especially to organizations that don't necessarily have full-time staff in this area. So as you can probably tell, I'm not an expert on legal careers per se or on the law, which is partly why I was so excited to attend this event and learn from the other speakers. But if you think that I'll be able to, if you think we might be able to help just in terms of kind of general career considerations and thinking about how you can help animals most effectively, you might be interested in our one-to-one careers advice service, which closes, our applications for that close in a couple of weeks' time. So I'll put the link to that in the chat in case anybody here is interested in applying for that. It's completely free, and yeah, it'd be great to speak to you. So, okay, moving on to the other speakers who are the main event with their more specific expertise on the topic. So the way this is going to work is we're going to have about 10 minutes for each panelist to introduce themselves and their work and how that help animals, and then we'll move to Q&A. So yeah, please don't, I mean, if you want to type a question and put it in the chat, then that would be great. You don't need to sort of hold on to it and forget about it. I can read those out, or I can allow you to speak and say them yourself. Or once the speakers have done, you can just jump in with questions. I think actually if people are comfortable with it, it might be easiest when it gets to it if we use the raise hand function, just because there are so many different people on the call. So if you're on the participants section, you can see there's a raise hand function, and I'll sort of skim up and down and see and call people's names. We'll see how that works. But yeah, we'll adjust as needed, and I'll remind you at the time once people have given their introductory talks. So, okay, with that, let's move on to hear from some of the exciting speakers themselves. So Iain, let's start with you if you're happy to. So Iain O'Donnell is a barrister at the First Crown Court Office Row Chambers and is one of the leading barristers specialising in animal cruelty cases. Iain, would you like to explain what work you do and any other thoughts you have about legal careers and ways that individuals in the audience might be able to help animals? And as I mentioned, I'm especially personally interested in some of the options outside of the non-profit space, but feel free to talk about whatever you think is most helpful.
Sure. Well, let me talk first about the circumstances by which I ended up working in the area of animal welfare personally, and then I can probably spend 3 or 4 minutes describing what I think will be the best avenues for the delegates to potentially get into it themselves. And as you just heard, I'm a barrister at 1 Crown Office Row. We're a big set of chambers based in the Temple, and we do all sorts of different work, really. It's one of the traditional old big common law sets. And I would be lying if I said that I had a plan when I finished my law conversion course that I was going to go and work in criminal prosecutions for animal welfare charities such as the RSPCA or for local authorities. I mean, most barristers who end up fortunate enough to get pupillage as I was, kind of slightly take what they're given, especially if they're in a general common law set, because you tend to sort of find your way and you have a couple of good results in certain things, and then those solicitors might instruct you again and you find yourself doing something completely different to what you originally envisaged you would be doing. I mean, the circumstances by which I came to prosecute principally for the RSPCA, but also for local authorities around England and Wales in animal welfare cases, is a perfect illustration of the complete randomness of this sort of situation. I finished my pupillage at Francis Taylor Building, a chambers just around the corner from 1 Crown Office Row, and then I did a third sixth at Crown Office Row, and I shared a room with a chap called Paul Rogers, who happened to have an RSPCA prosecution practice as part of a pretty heavyweight criminal practice, acting in the Crown Courts and the Old Bailey, etc., in big criminal matters. And he was looking to consolidate and indeed expand his RSPCA prosecution practice. And he was very keen to keep it safeguarded from anyone else in chambers who might potentially take it from him. So he had to give, the clerks compelled him to take someone from chambers with him to do a sort of nationwide tour to all of the various different solicitors that prosecute for the RSPCA. And he decided to take me on the basis that I was the most junior and therefore the least threatening to his practice. And I remember being really, really unhappy about it and moaning to the senior clerk about how I was going to miss out on 2 or 3 really important small claims cases that would have paid me £150 each. And this was a disgrace. And, I needed to be sort of consolidating my junior practice and all the rest of it. And more importantly, I knew absolutely nothing about animal welfare. Back then, it was the Protection of Animals Act, which is the predecessor legislation to the Animal Welfare Act 2006, which you may well be familiar with already. Broadly speaking, the same sort of principles, but pretty complicated stuff. And the thing that really got me was that the solicitors to whom I was supposed to be an expert in speaking around the country had all been prosecuting for the RSPCA as their regional agents for many, many years. And we're all grown-ups and all fully understood the game and thought, well, actually, who's this kid who's coming along with Mr. Rogers, and why on earth do we want to listen to him? So it's a fairly intimidating set of circumstances. But I just fell into it thereafter. I mean, fortunately, I didn't entirely drop the ball when I was doing those lectures. And even more fortunately, within a year of us coming back, Paul Rogers got admitted onto the panel of special prosecutors in the War Crimes Tribunal and went off to prosecute people like Milosevic, and ultimately had to sort of surrender his position as a self-employed barrister in chambers. So he went on to grander things, and really they were looking for an answer to the question that he had originally been. And these solicitors said, well, what about that kid who went with Rogers on the tour? So I sort of fell into it, really. And it went from there. And I've had a few fortunate results in the higher courts for the RSPCA. And as a result of that, I ended up doing some work for local authorities as well. It tends to be either the RSPCA or local authorities that prosecute animal welfare offences. It tends not to be the CPS in England and Wales. Interestingly, if you go north of the border in Scotland, the prosecutor fiscal does everything, including animal welfare. And it may well be in 5 or 10 years that's how it goes here. But for the time being, if you were interested in trying to prosecute animal welfare offences, the first port of call remains trying to get work through the RSPCA. And I think from the point of view of a student interested in getting into this area, the best means by which you might try and get your face known amongst the people who prosecute at the RSPCA is to ingratiate yourselves with some of the regional solicitors. And they tend to be defence solicitors, criminal defence solicitors, in the big sort of cities all around England and Wales, who act as the RSPCA's prosecuting agents in their area and prosecute offences and then instruct barristers, depending on their own preferences and indeed any instructions they have specifically from the RSPCA to use specific barristers for these sorts of cases. If you wanted to try and get into doing animal welfare prosecutions work as a solicitor on the other side of the profession rather than the bar like me, it would simply be a matter of Googling which regional firms, starting in the area where you live, I'd suggest, prosecute as agents on behalf of the RSPCA, and suggesting going along to do some work experience of whatever form, and trying to ingratiate yourselves with those firms directly and potentially even get a training contract with them. Unsurprisingly, it's a pretty small niche area, and it's incredibly jealously guarded by those solicitors. And it seems, I'm constantly told, there's a sort of queue of far more qualified and more able barristers than me from other chambers who are sort of, you know, desperate to come along and take all of the RSPCA prosecutions work and local authority prosecutions work. So it's a pretty competitive marketplace. But that would, I think that would be the best suggestion, really, if you wanted to try and get into it. It wouldn't really do to sort of go to RSPCA HQ in Southwater in Sussex and knock on the door and say, I'm interested in prosecuting. They might need to see a few more credentials given how competitive it is. But yeah, I think start by identifying and then trying to make friends with the relevant individuals, preferably the partner, in the regional solicitors firms that tend to prosecute for the RSPCA. And from there, you may well find yourself, if you get into this sort of work on either side of the profession, potentially getting instructed at the bar actually by local authorities that prosecute animal welfare offences, or indeed potentially defending those who are alleged to have committed animal welfare offences for other defence firms. I mean, there's a whole other micro world of specific defence advocates who routinely defend these cases all over the country. And one tends to see the same sort of faces time and time again, irrespective of whether you're in a court in Bangor or in, you know, the Royal Courts of Justice, or in the Old Bailey, or you're in, you know, Daventry Magistrates Court, wherever it may be. I think that's probably all you really need to hear from me on this. I've been fortunate rather than able, I think, is probably the sign off there. It's about being in the right place at the right time, and I've been lucky, really, which is how I've ended up falling into this area of work.
Great, thanks very much, Iain. Yeah, a couple of follow-up questions. One in the chat I can see, but seeing as we're a little tiny bit ahead of time, might as well ask now. Those roles that you mentioned, do you have a sense of, you mentioned that they're quite often within other law firms that are focusing on a large variety of different work. The individuals who focus on these topics tend to, and yourself, do you tend to spend all your time on these cases, or do the individuals work on animal issues amongst other issues?
The solicitors of the firms that act as agents in the regions for the RSPCA vary very, very considerably, as the firms vary very considerably, often for historical reasons. They vary from firms that are kind of just outside Magic Circle and have kind of, you know, second offices in places like Tokyo or Singapore, to sort of one-man band type high street firms who've got there's a partner there that's been prosecuting for the RSPCA for sort of 20 or 30 years. The individual solicitors at these firms that prosecute for the RSPCA tend to do just that, or that and one other thing, and they tend to be the partners. Whereas, you know, in my case, that's just one of many things that I do. I mean, I'm sort of pretty fortunate, and as I say, we're in a common law practice, and I do all sorts of work. I've just finished acting for the survivor groups in the independent inquiry into child sex abuse, for example. So a big 5-year-long inquiry, which has got nothing to do with animal welfare. So I do a bit of everything. But what I would say is, when you get these big animal welfare prosecutions in the diary, they tend to take over, and everything else sort of gets sidelined, understandably, because strangely they tend to be treated as trial of the century. Now, not just by the prosecution authorities, but it's a never-ending source of amazement to me how violently sometimes these cases are defended on behalf of those accused of animal welfare offences. They're defended as if they're facing kind of triple murder charges sometimes. And there are more human rights type issues that one faces in these sorts of criminal prosecutions than in often, you know, straight human rights type cases, in my experience.
Great, thank you. And there was one slightly more technical question in the chat before we move on to other speakers. Has the RSPCA now fully handed all cases of illegal hunting over to the CPS as was planned?
It's not clear, actually, that. I mean, the last Hunting Act case that I did was a year or so ago in the West Country, and that was due to last a few months. And that was, I was instructed by the RSPCA on it. This is still something that's sort of ongoing. The difficulty that there is that the CPS have neither the manpower nor indeed the expertise, you know, with all due respect to them, they do everything else, to prosecute these sorts of often very, very technical cases. and they're often very political as well. Hunting, as you mentioned, is probably one of the most political areas. That and any form of organised animal fighting, I find, cockfighting and organised dog fighting to be, hugely political. And interestingly, very, very, strenuously defended as well. But no, I don't know the answer to that, actually. I think it's going to happen. But whether it's been entirely handed over to the CPS, I don't know. I'd be surprised if it has. As I say, I don't really know that CPS have the manpower.
Great, thanks very much, Iain. Yeah, let's move on to some other speakers, and then we'll come back to some questions at the end. So, Sonul, let's go to you. So, Sonul Badiani-Hamment is a UK External Affairs Advisor at World Animal Protection, and obviously slightly more directly involved in the non-profit context there. So, Sonul, would you like to explain what work you've been doing and any other thoughts you have about legal careers in or out of the non-profit sector for the audience?
Thanks, Jamie. Yeah, so I guess I'll do the similar thing to Iain and just say how I got here a little bit. I think it's, for me, it's really interesting to see how many people are attending today. I think it's just amazing to have this opportunity to talk about animal law careers, because honestly, when I was studying law, I wouldn't have known where to begin. And that, I guess, it's really nice to see that progress has already been made in that sense. For me, it was a very traditional career path that I saw set out. It was solicitor or barrister and the sort of very normal areas of law. And actually, I started going down the criminal bar route and quickly realised that I actually just wasn't emotionally cut out for it. I found the cases extremely difficult. So it's very quickly I found myself in a situation where I dedicated my career, studies and all of this stuff to pursuing this career that was wrong for me. And it took me a while to realise that I didn't need to go down that route to become a good lawyer and advocate for causes that I believed in. And for me, that is animals. And that's something I've always wanted to. Animals, I always say I like working for animals, but I couldn't work out how to work for them. So it did take me a while. And I started out in the not-profit sector, working, for example, in the Congo on human rights issues, moved back to London, started a family and started working on homelessness in the UK. But I could never escape wanting to work for animals. And eventually, actually, my husband said, forget it, put this experience behind you that you've done for 5 years and just start from the bottom as a campaigner. Just get in and show them what you can do using law and fighting legislative change. Because it's interesting what you say at the beginning about how not all NGOs hire legal experts or even know to look for them. There might be other untraditional roles that we don't necessarily think of, but once you've gotten in, you can also show your worth and show how powerful using law and policy is in order to advance progress for animals. And that's kind of the route that I took. And so I just started out campaigning, and now I've ended up in an amazing role that, I'm not going to lie, it is really, really difficult to find these sorts of roles. It's difficult to find a not-for-profit that, you can mould your position within, and I have managed that with World Animal Protection. And now I work with politicians, so across different parties, with peers, with governments, with lots of different NGOs as well, with academics, with vets, so many different stakeholders, but all for this one purpose of improving animal welfare policy and improving legislation for animals. And it's an amazing job where law is relevant every single day. But as I say, when the not-for-profits are recruiting, they don't necessarily know that, but the impact you can make with that analytical mind, with that knowledge, by coming into this campaigning sector is huge. So, for example, recently I've been working on the wildlife trade and the COVID-19 pandemic, which also shows you about the intersections as well, and how it's not just animals. You're working with other issues that are important of the day as well. And we've been targeting the G20. So for months now, I've been negotiating language with the UK government that they've been championing on our behalf. And we just had that signed off last week by the 20, which is just huge. I mean, okay, huge for us because we know how long it takes to get policy and legislative change through. Incremental, really. But it's just that there really is so much you can do with policy that builds towards that bigger legislative change for animals. So for example, the global wildlife trade ban, definitely not going to happen this year, probably not going to happen for quite a while, but the little policy changes building up to all of these bigger things is still capturing animals, and there's just so much you can do. And I think what's also really exciting about this sort of career is that you develop other skills as well. For example, I like being a bit creative, I like communications. Those were things that I couldn't quite capture again with that more traditional route that I really enjoy from my career, that was unexpected as well, that I didn't necessarily know about myself as a law student, that was, you know, I was really academic and didn't think about things like that, and that's quite exciting. And also, for example, putting things like your legal debating skills to other uses. So I speak on lots of panels. I spoke with the Shadow Secretary of State for DEFRA last week on a panel about wildlife trade. You know, I debate MPs, I'm on the radio a lot. And so there are other ways of bringing in those skills that are still really useful. And it's essentially realizing that you can use law just to be a damn good advocate for whatever you believe in. And if that's animals, then amazing, because they need more of us. Yeah, I don't know if there's anything else, but.
Nice, thank you very much, Sonal. Yeah, so I'm intrigued. You presented your story in that kind of working out ways to apply the law in the non-profit context. Were the roles that you've had, were they explicitly asking for legal qualifications and legal experience, or did you really just, you applied for more kind of like generic campaign roles and then brought in your experience in that sense?
Exactly. And I think the role I've now got, I've built it into a lot more than it was at the beginning. And so now actually they're recruiting my maternity leave cover, and I rewrote the job description. And part of that is, for example, an ability to draft legislation and to negotiate on legislation and policy with stakeholders. But that was never there to begin with. And that's kind of what I mean. Not-for-profits they're under-resourced for starters. And so they're not necessarily going to be asking for all these different qualifications, especially because it's, you know, it's sort of lobbying and campaigning role, and it's a policy-based role. But once you're in, the amount you can do is huge. And you can really use that skill set to make progress. Great,
yeah. And are there roles that are more explicitly in the legal space in World Animal Protection? I mean, it's a very large organisation, literally hundreds of employees. So I'm surprised if there aren't at least some in the organisation somewhere.
No, there aren't. But having said that, so for example, I recently wrote a resolution for UNEA, for the UK government to champion. Now, that's something that, because I've done it, they would expect more of that, and from hopefully whoever comes in. But it's not something that's necessarily been a role that they've gone out for.
Interesting, thank you. Yeah, we've got a question in the chat as well, so I'll read that one out. It's from Ali. Is there ever an international element to animal law work, or collaboration between animal rights lawyers across borders? I guess some of the other speakers might have something to say on this as well, but I guess it's interesting given your experience in World Animal Protection as well, obviously a very international focused organisation.
Yeah, so absolutely. So for example, this resolution that's been drafted, if the UK government decide to champion it, we will then in World Animal Protection work across our different country offices and our networks to get other countries support on the language. There might be some negotiations in the background, things like that. But even just the G20 work that we've just done, it's not necessarily collaboration on animal law, but it's collaboration on animal policy. So one of the key ways that we got the 20 to agree was to stop a country being a bloc. And that was feeding intel from there into the UK government and things like that. So you're working across borders in that way.
Great, thank you. Do either of you other speakers want to jump in on that question about whether there's been an international element in your work, or what you've seen other people in this space take part in?
Well, I can assist if you want. I mean, there tends not to be, in my experience, because different nation states have different minimum standards of animal welfare below which they won't let their citizens fall in terms of the way that they care for animals. And it's nice to know that actually we're at the top, or pretty near the top. In my experience, relatively limited experience of comparing where we are in our animal welfare legislation to situation in countries overseas. But I mean, there is a sliding scale. I mean, it's not a particularly pleasant thing to hear, but the reality is the Animal Welfare Act, for example, is based on anthropomorphic principles, and we tend to attribute more value to certain animals than others. A fact that I don't particularly like, and often doesn't sit very well with people who prosecute, but it's a fact nonetheless. But that said, I think we're probably at the top or near the top in terms of international standards of animal welfare.
Great, thanks. And just to plug a resource from Sonul's organisation, World Animal Protection do have what they call the Animal Protection Index, which compares legislation and regulations in different countries. So people interested in looking into that could look up that resource. Francis, did you have anything to add on that question, or shall I just introduce you and you can do your intro speech?
No, if we could just go on to the intro speech, that'd be fine.
Great, will do. Yeah. Also, just a quick note, Gabriella, thanks for the question. I think I'll leave that one for the end because it feels like it could go well for all the speakers. So yeah, we'll move on to Francis. So yeah, Francis Allen, thanks very much. And Francis is one of the founders of A-Law itself. Sorry, I'm just lost my notes. I just want to make sure I don't say the wrong thing. Never a good start. Yeah, he's a barrister and founder of A-Law, and is also at the Goldsmith Animal Rights team at Goldsmith Chambers. And so, Francis, do you want to again explain the work that you do at both of those different roles that you play, and yeah, any other thoughts you've got to share about the apologies, that's my doorbell. I'll mute myself in a second. Careers in way to help animals. I'll pass over to Francis.
Okay, thank you, Jamie. I'm going to start by just to speak about the journey that I've had to get where I am now. It started quite a few years ago now, and I didn't start out to be a lawyer. I had absolutely no ambitions or any intentions at all to be a lawyer, and I didn't come from a legal background. My interest was animals. And I had studied zoology at university, and my goal was to be Jane Goodall. But when I started at university, I realised that everybody wanted to be Jane Goodall, or Diane Fossey, or Sir David Attenborough, one of the three. And although I had thoughts at that time of sort of studying animal behaviour in the wild, again, I realised that that was a very competitive area, because that's what everybody doing zoology wanted to do. I didn't have any particular concrete plans about what I was going to do with my degree. But in I think it was the third year, my final year, we had to do what I think was called a literature survey. And I chose the topic of mammals and the law. And I came across a book, which I actually found again on my shelf this morning, which was called An Introduction to Animal Law. And it was written by Margaret E. Cooper. And she was a lawyer who was married to a vet. And this book was, I used quite a lot whilst doing my literature survey. And whilst doing it, this book really started my interest in law and how I could actually use law in terms of promoting the interests and rights of animals. And just as an aside, it was quite weird that, and I think it was around the year 2000, when I was in a hotel in Ruhengeri in Rwanda, when I actually bumped into Margaret Cooper and her husband, who were having dinner at the next table, because her husband had been a vet with the Down Fossey Foundation. So I was actually able to speak to her and tell her the influence and impact that her book had had. So following that, I then started to look at careers in the law. And there was basically either seemed to me to be a solicitor or a barrister. And again, whilst thinking earlier today with reference to this talk, I can't actually remember why I chose the bar as opposed to being a solicitor. I think maybe because I had the impression that as a barrister you could do your own thing. So that may have been an influence. I did a mini pupillage at an environmental law set, but there were no sets which had any sort of specific animal law team. Also, as part of your training, you had to eat 12 dinners, which I presume you still have to do, I don't know. And at the dinners, there was a sort of segregated vegetarian table. And it was on a table that I then met a guy called Jeremy Chipperfield. And we sort of chatted, and it turned out that both of us had really come into the law for the same thing, in terms of looking to the law to be able to promote the interests and rights of animals. But we didn't keep particularly in touch. We'd bump into each other at dining, obviously, again, because we were both on this segregated table, or at bar school. And then I started my first tenancy, and about a month after starting, went into chambers, and who was there but Jeremy? And that really seemed a coincidence too far. And it seemed fate that we were going to get together and start a group for lawyers who were interested in animal welfare. So that's really how ALAW started. I think the original name was Lawyers for Animal Welfare. Paula might remember. Then it became ALAW, the Association of Lawyers for Animal Welfare. And now it's ALAW, the UK Centre for Animal Law. But what I just want to say now is that ALAW is where it is today, completely down to the work and dedication of Paula, and absolutely nothing to do with Jeremy and I. Now, it was still the case, and that there was no sort of specific team at the bar which was specifically dedicated to animal law. But it seemed as time sort of was going on that things were starting to change. And I think certainly I would say over the last 5 years, I mean, there's been a huge interest and rise in veganism. The first solicitors firm, Advocates for Animals, was started. And it seemed really that this was now the right time for the very first team at the bar, specifically dedicated to animal rights, to be started. And really what we hope is that this is the start for animal rights to be seen as a specific area of law, and to be taken seriously as an area of law, And I'm pleased to say that we've got our official launch on the 8th of December, which we're all looking very much forward to. But in terms of careers, animal law really comes into lots of different areas. It can come into housing, crime, family, public law, employment. So there's lots of different areas which has an animal law element to them. I mean, my specific interest is in public law and in strategic litigation, but lots of different areas. You can use the law in those areas to promote the rights and interests of animals and to up the knowledge of other people, and the fact that these are cases coming before the court where there is an animal law element argued before the court. And the more that that is done, I think it's going to be the case that animal law is going to be taken as a serious area of law. So that's all really I wanted to say.
Great, thanks very much, Frances. Right, so I think it'd be great if we can move on to some of the questions then. There's been a few in the chat, and I can see at least one person with their hand up. So again, if people want to type questions into the chat, then that's great. I can see, and we can sort of combine questions if they're similar, that sort of thing. But also, if you want to just stick your hand up and say it verbally, then you can try that. It's on the participants tab, and then there's a button for raise hand if you want to try that. So the first question is, well, there's a couple of questions essentially about different training avenues, and I think I'll combine them in case people want to chip in on both things at the same time. So one of the questions asks about particular legal training routes. The question is, what area of law would you say is the best to do a training contract in order to get skills to help animals afterwards? And if there are particular kind of like formal training routes in that sense, I guess. And then another question also asks if there are recognized additional courses specifically related to animal law or policy that could be taken in addition to the law degree. And I assume the questioner is asking about all formats, like online or more formal education or whatever. So any of the speakers want to jump in on that first of all?
I can start off, Jamie. Just in terms of courses, Winchester offers a postgraduate course in, I think it's animal law, ethics and policy. I should know because I teach on the undergraduate part of the course, but not the postgraduate course. And I think it's either Edinburgh or Glasgow that also has a postgraduate qualification, although I find that I think that one tends to be more science-based or more geared towards people with a science background, but nonetheless covers animal law and policy and ethics. There's also an animal law and an animals and society degree now at Winchester, which is not a law degree, but it's about the whole issues of animals and society. And I teach the animal law and policy module on that over 2 terms to the second years. So there are some courses out there, but I think because it was one of those areas where there was a gap, that's why we have, at A-Law, we run so many training courses, and why we've been running the basics bite-sized series. We're also planning a more structured animal law course as well that we'll be able to offer virtually. And we've been very privileged to be able to work with the academics who are actually teaching in this area. So the courses with animal law modules within the LLB degree, there's a handful of them across the country. And I think this is an area, my experience really echoes Sonul's, when I was at university, I was very interested in animals, but there was no way of, studying in this area. There was no career route. So I think we really need to try and encourage more animal law and policy on the agenda of our undergraduate degree courses as well. But there are courses across the country. And just coming on to areas of practice, I know Frances has already mentioned housing law, elements of family law where there are concerns around coercive control and abuse and so on. So if you find yourself in an area that you naturally think this has got nothing to do with animals, actually, you know, it often does intersect. Licensing law, I was really surprised at how helpful it's been to work with a specialist licensing barrister, Sarah Clover, who has, you know, brilliant expertise in animal establishment licensing, and she's been able to use that to help some of the campaigning around Lucy's Law and against, you know, the puppy farming. So it's also just about looking at those areas where you find yourself in practice and you may not have as much control over your career in the early days, but also being able to, you know, look for those areas where there is an intersection.
Great, thanks, Paula. Anybody else want to chip in from the speakers?
I think just to say, really, to echo what Paula's said, and to say that also if you find yourself in an area, say housing, and you can see that there's an argument involving an animal, then to use the argument. You know, again, getting back to my point that the more times that such arguments are put before the court, I think that's really the route forward in terms of getting this seen as a serious area of law.
From my perspective at the bar, I think if the delegates are interested in maintaining a minimum standard of animal welfare, i.e. upholding animal rights, the areas that I would recommend you look to study in are public law, because there's nearly always a judicial review. I mean, I've done a number of them myself. Obviously pure criminal law, because in terms of the number of cases that are brought, I think, you know, throughout England and Wales, involving animals specifically, I'd have to say that the criminal courts have the bulk of them. And also, if you did a seat during your training contract in criminal law as well, you then are able to springboard into professional discipline, and that opens up a whole, you know, a vast number of areas involving, for example, veterinary practice and veterinary nursing practice. And I mean, at the beginning of the year, I did a fairly long disciplinary matter in the Royal College for the Veterinary Defence Society, defending a vet who'd been accused of doing all sorts of unpleasant things. But yeah, crime would get you into that, as well as getting you into potentially working for local authorities or prosecution charities. And public, I think, gives you a very, very good general understanding of the relevant legislation in this area. It tends to be sort of more, you know, scientific procedures type stuff that I've always done through, you know, judicial reviews. But I would suggest those are the areas where you're most likely to be fighting the good fight in animal welfare terms.
I just add one thing as well, I suppose, which is that when I was studying law, absolutely, as Paula was saying, I said earlier, there was nothing on animal law at all. But looking back, you know, I had a lot of flexibility in what subject I wanted to specialise in for my thesis. And at the time I chose human rights and gender. There's nothing to stop anyone in their third year now in this seminar right here deciding actually I'm going to specialise in animal law, because there's a lot you can do. And one more comment, and it, you know, just on masters and further education, it's very expensive and it's not affordable for everyone. It's, you know, it's also difficult to get in, and there's a lot to be said also for just getting stuck into work and starting to transfer those skills over and using your knowledge and learning on the side yourself, attending these great courses that are for free too. I got to the point in my career, as I mentioned, that I completely changed from human rights to animals. And I went and started talking to my same universities from before and said, I want to do a PhD and I want to do it in animal law. And they were really excited, which I found shocking because, again, it was not that long ago that I'd left when no one was really interested. And actually I walked away thinking, do you know what, rather than spending 4 years on a PhD, I'm just going to crack on. That was the right decision for me. It's not for everyone, but it's just something to consider.
Great, thank you very much. Mina, you've had your hand up for a while, or Mina, sorry, not sure which one it is. Do you want to jump in with your question?
Hi, is that me? Sorry, I was supposed to come
Yes.
up as Matilda, but yeah, nickname's fine anyway. So Thank you to the speakers. That was really interesting. One thing I always struggle with, because I'm kind of interested in working as an advocate for animals in law and policy, and what I always struggle with is the fact that we're kind of constrained within a paradigm that, as Iain pointed out, is very anthropomorphic, very speciesist and everything. There's not a lot of space for kind of advancing the system beyond these, enormous and significant incremental changes, but they're always kind of very welfare oriented, and they often, by kind of condoning, pursuing animal abuse charges for example, people who abuse their dogs, continuing to accept, the abuse of farmed animals as the norm, etc. And I really struggle with that. And I think one thing that would be really interesting would be to have the ability to engage more practically through policy, for example, with, slightly more maybe conceptual or critical approaches. And that's something that I just don't really see how that can be done, but I feel like it really needs to be done. So I was just wondering if any of the speakers could have any thoughts based on their experience, for example, on how we might be able to kind of get past that paradigm that we're a bit stuck in now, where we can improve welfare, but it's very difficult to actually bring about changes if we're looking at rights, if we're looking at ethics beyond treating animals as property and just, making sure that they get mutilated in slightly less painful ways. So yeah, if anybody had any thoughts. Also, just one thing I just wanted to say in passing, if that's all right, is there's also an animal rights law centre in Cambridge now, which is doing really good work at the moment, assembling resources and doing research, but with the goal of disseminating that to educational institutions to further animal rights and animal law opportunities everywhere. And they do really good work as well. So I really recommend people kind of getting in touch with them, as well as A-Law, who have really inspired me the past few years, and I really thank them for that. Thank you. That was very long.
Great, thank you. Yeah, if people want to check through the chat, people have been sharing a few other resources as well. So thanks for sharing that one about the Cambridge Centre. So the questions of the speakers was essentially about the opportunities for promoting rights and gains in rights in addition to the welfare improvements. If anybody has anything to add on that.
Well, it is very difficult, but I think, again, as I think we were saying earlier, it's about just getting into court and to be putting those arguments to the court. And the more that is done, and the more used to those arguments that judges and courts hear, we're going to be hopefully able to start pushing the boundaries and chipping away at these ideas. And that's really the only way that you can do it in order to bring change, is by changing the law. But you've got to bear in mind that obviously, laws should be reflecting society, and as society's views change, so the law should change. And so again, that's why we need to be trying to get into the courts with the arguments, to be trying to push these boundaries.
I can add a little bit from the policy side, if it's helpful as well. So before the COVID-19 pandemic, when we talked about wildlife trade, for example, wild animal protection, we used to discuss something called a positive list, and how that was a really ambitious aim, really, for animals. So, and I remember advising only last year that it wasn't something that I thought was a good legislative ask in the UK, because we weren't ready. And then this year, COVID-19 happened, and there's a lot of evidence that's emerged that's linked the pandemic to the wildlife trade. And so there's become an opportunity to shift that conversation into, actually, whilst we're framing it in welfare terms and in terms of public health and the environment, it's actually more rights-based in terms of progress for animals too. So, I mean, Francis is completely right. You have to reflect what's currently happening and where progress can be made, and where there is appetite. But those shifts are happening. For example, antimicrobial resistance, one of the biggest challenges to public health, and also in terms of animal welfare, you know, we can really make huge changes there as well. And so it's about grabbing those big opportunities of the day as well to shift that conversation, even if you're framing it in another way.
Great. Iain, did you have anything you wanted to add on that question?
Well, I mean, it's very, very difficult from the perspective of the practitioner in court, because we're essentially there to sort of play the hand that we're dealt. But, you know, I hear the points that are being made about, you know, when you get into court, doing your damnedest to try and highlight the bizarre anthropomorphism, as I would describe it, that underlies all of the legislation in relation to animal welfare in this country. I mean, but as I say, it's extremely difficult. I mean, you can have, you know, circuit judges hearing these serious cases, you know, involving organised animal fighting, where dogs are caused to suffer, I don't know, 5 units of trauma per dog, and, you know, the judges are absolutely disgusted. And then they go out for the luncheon adjournment to Asda and eat their farm chicken sandwiches before coming back. I would suspect that the chicken that they're eating have suffered comparatively more units of damage as a result of the manner in which they are processed for the purposes of that sandwich. The whole thing is based on an anthropomorphic hypocrisy, in my view, and it's very, very difficult to try and sort of tread, you know, at the end of the day, we're just, as barristers, I've said it sort of slightly belittlingly, we're sort of clowns for hire on one level. We're there to take our instructions and act on behalf of our clients. Fortunately, the sort of work that I do, and it sounds like Francis does, is generally, as I say, fighting the good fight on behalf of animal welfare. But there are plenty of briefs out there where you're doing precisely the opposite. I don't think, actually, that the courts are the place to effect the sort of change that is being addressed in the question from Mina at all. I think it has to come through pressure on the legislature, frankly. Without that, you're not going to get anywhere. Past developments and progress in animal welfare has always come through that avenue, not through advocacy in the courts.
Great, thanks, Iain. Not the most heartwarming note, but
Well,
important to discuss. Yeah, no, appreciate that. Thank you. Paula, we're pretty much bang on the hour. Do you want to wrap it up at the time, or shall we let people stick around and see if anybody's got further questions? What would you prefer to do?
I think we'll wrap up and let our speakers go if they'd like to go. If anyone wants to stay and carry on and having a chat with any of us, or if any of the speakers want to stay, then we can have another sort of 5 or 10 minutes. I just want to thank everyone for coming along and supporting this event, because it's been really good to see so many people here and so many people interested. And I'm also acutely aware that not everyone is going to be able to develop a career in this area. And I think it's important that even if you don't, and even if you develop a career in a completely different area of law, unrelated to animals, that you can still use your legal voice to speak up for animals. And perhaps that also feeds into Iain's point that not all these cases are going to be played out in front of the court, but there's a lot of lobbying work to be done. And we have the skills to do that lobbying work and to do it sensibly, and to have a very rational voice and to have an authoritative voice on those issues. And I think we need to have a much greater conversation within the legal profession about animal interests. We need to be debating these issues. We need to be hearing from people who disagree with us. We just need to be having the conversation. If you pick up a law journal and you pick up a legal magazine, you know, how often do you actually read a serious article debating issues around personhood, or debating issues around Lucy's law, or ear cropping, all of the things that we take for granted because we're seeing it within the animal advocacy movement? We're not actually having those debates and that awareness. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so pleased to see Goldsmith saying, you know, we have an animal rights law team now, and seeing the work of Iain O'Donnell and him putting on his website as well at One Crown Office Road. We do animal welfare work. We're happy to put our hands up and say, we do this work. It's respectable work, it's difficult work, and it's serious. Even just the other day, there was an MP who I think commented about the trade and agriculture bills and the attempts to enshrine animal welfare in law and trade standards as, you know, just being very emotive. And I think we need to be much bolder in saying this isn't about emotiveness, it's about what's fair and just when we're dealing with sentient animals. So you can still use your voice, you can still lobby for animals, whether it's your career or not, and we do support you in trying to provide opportunities for pro bono and voluntary work, trying to get you involved with issues and campaign work that the groups are doing and supporting the work that the groups are doing. And you know, again, that's not always possible, but you can write a blog article, raise awareness that way. We have our student outreach, so we can help with that. We set up university groups, discussion groups. Tiffany, you know, is magnificent in, you know, providing those resources to our students. We have our law journal, we have an e-magazine, so it's all there. So come and get involved with it. And I know Jamie as well, be really happy to hear from people who, you know, really want to have more specific advice in relation to careers. So I went on a bit there, Jamie. You won't ask me again.
Oh, you organised the event. I'm not one to complain. Yeah, perfect timing, I think, really. So yeah, I'll echo what you just said and thank everyone for attending and thank all the speakers. And yeah, it's been great. So I mean, I guess we can keep going with some questions. If anybody needs to leave, then feel free. And if we've still got some people, we can keep going with a few more questions. But again, thanks everybody for joining.
And we will share the link to the YouTube channel where you'll be able to find the Advocates for Animals talk from David Thomas as well after this. Great.
Well, rather than sitting around, if it looks like we've still got some people here, so I'll press on with a question if people are still happy to discuss. One that came up.
I'm just going to say bye.
Okay, thank you, Francis.
Bye.
So one question that came up was whether there are opportunities to use legal training and legal backgrounds in international institutions like the UN. And I'll jump in and just sort of push a resource that I've created. We have a skills profile on Animal Advocacy Careers website about, again, it's about government lobbying and policy roles, but legal training did come up as a frequent thing that our interviewees said was a really common route into roles in those institutions in general. So again, not necessarily focusing always on technical legal stuff per se, but the training itself being helpful. So did anybody else want to jump in on thoughts on whether there are opportunities to use that legal background in international institutions like the UN or I guess the European Union or so on?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, we talked about this before, but you were asking about, does World Animal Protection specifically recruit legal experts? No. But is it an advantage on your CV? Definitely. And is it a skill set that, you know, a lot of my colleagues have? Absolutely. And it's a very powerful background. So 100%, so that's World Animal Protection. But we've also got people there who are lawyers in the background who've come from the UN or from the EU institutions. I myself was trained to go into work in EU institutions, and I came back to the UK and didn't want to do it. And it's very powerful. And so whilst it's not a prerequisite, you've definitely got an edge.
Great. Anyone else want to comment on that? Cool. Well, there was another question that a couple of people had, and of course they might have left by now, I'm not sure, but a couple of people touched on if they have a undergraduate in a topic that is not directly relevant to law, whether you have any advice for continuing down the kind of legal pathway. And I assume they're talking about some of the options that Iain was talking about in terms of solicitors and that sort of thing, but potentially also just, I guess maybe Sonul, you might be able to speak to developing the same sorts of skill sets that you've been emphasizing as well, whether people who have other undergraduate degrees can, you know, whether you have recommendations for how they can build those skills and enter relevant careers. And actually the two people who commented both had zoology undergraduate degrees, interestingly, but you don't have to tailor your comments to that, I guess.
Well, I'll just add that again, that's a very common degree that people come to World Animal Protection with. And you have a lot of people, for example, working in research that come from that background, and it's extremely useful. And I mean, the other stuff, like a lot of the stuff that I do now, you know, really can be learned. It's not like you need law. It does give you an edge, because it's about being able to use the law to campaign in a better manner for animals and understand it, but you can also learn it all. So yeah, there's no barriers there. It's just at the moment there's still not enough jobs, I'd say.
Great. Anybody else want to jump in on that?
Well, I mean, I didn't do a law degree, if that's of assistance to anyone. I did a degree in PPE and then did the law conversion course afterwards. And I was absolutely convinced I wasn't going to be a lawyer when I was at university. I thought I was going to do a PhD and spend all my time just being an academic and avoiding the real world. And circumstances transpired against me. And I ended up becoming a lawyer for reasons completely irrelevant to my interest in animal welfare. And then, as I've already said to you, when I became a lawyer, it was really through happen chance as much as anything else that I ended up falling into prosecution work and then developed a practice in animal welfare. I mean, one of the other hats I wear is I'm head of recruitment at Crown Office Row. So I deal with all of the pupillage applications and then chair our final interview panel, which takes a day, and the people who've got to that stage, you know, so of those, whatever it is, final 15 or 20, we select 2 for 12-month funded pupillages each year. We're indifferent to whether or not someone has a law degree or another degree and did a 1-year law conversion course. If anything, I suppose if I were pushed, I would say I prefer people who don't have law degrees, because they're more likely to say something interesting to us. And that really is what the object of the exercise is, to charm us and to interest us and to separate yourselves from everyone else. Because as I'm sure you're all aware, people who come into law these days, they've all got all of the qualifications that that one would expect of them, and really what you're looking for is something that makes you somewhat different. And I should say that voluntary experience involving animal welfare work may well be that something.
Great, thank you. Yeah, apologies. I think we might have some more questions. One that I had earlier that I wanted to ask is one that I always find helpful to ask in these kind of career conversations, is just if you have any thoughts on the sort of personal characteristics, or just any other aspects, any other thoughts you have on what might make somebody an especially good or bad fit with the role types that either you have or that we've been talking about that other people have in terms of legal careers that help animals. So that idea of characteristics and traits and experiences and preferences that might make them, that affect their sort of personal fit with these role types.
Do you want me to talk about that? I mean, I
yeah,
suppose,
well, anyone, but yeah, go for it, Iain. Thank you.
In terms of characteristics, obviously you need to be pretty hardworking to, get into the law in the first instance. But I mean, I think the thing I would say to people to take away is be interesting, add a bit of colour to your applications. I don't think if one wanted a career in animal welfare law, certainly as a practitioner, either as a solicitor or at the bar, it helps to be too shrill. I think there is real benefit in presenting your arguments with objectivity bordering on the seeming indifference, if you really want them to make any, have any real impact. And when I first started prosecuting these sorts of animal welfare cases, I remember being accused by one of my barrister opponents of being a Nazi vegan terrorist at one stage, which I have to say I took as a compliment, but it wasn't meant as such. And the point is, if you come across as a little bit too pious or a little bit too righteous, I don't think you do yourself any favours. You've got to bear in mind that the tribunal may not share your views about animal welfare, about eating meat that has come from plainly unethical sources and these sorts of things. Bear in mind what I said about the hypocrisy in this area before. So I would suggest be interesting to get into the law in the first instance. Put something different on your application form, and then when you're in, try and pursue your brief or your instructions from your lay client with real objectivity, especially in this sort of area.
Great, thanks. And Sonul or Paul, either of you want to add a quick comment on that?
Yeah, I echo actually everything that Iain just said, and from that point about the being too shrill. I think Paula said earlier as well about being really rational, and that's where I think our backgrounds are very helpful, and tailoring your arguments to your audience. So a few months ago, I remember I was completely losing the Shadow Secretary of State for DEFRA, and I could just tell he wasn't going to support the campaign if I continued to talk about animals. So I switched it and talked about biodiversity loss instead and linked the issue there. And then within a minute, he was on board and has championed the legislative asks ever since. So you sometimes, and that's not to everyone's taste, I know, but sometimes to make progress for animals, you do have to link them and make progress for things that other people are prioritizing more. And that brings them up to, I think to that objectivity, being rational, highly analytical, but also with animals being quite tenacious, super dedicated, because it takes time. You have to be patient. It's not an area where we're going to see huge gains very quickly. I get really excited about wins like the G20 last week with some language. Actually, it's very small. It's going to take a long time to get the big legislative change. And so it is just going into this career as well, knowing that you have to be patient to see those big changes.
I would agree with both Sonal and Iain. I think those are really excellent points. And the only thing I would add is just get on with people, because we're in an area where there is such a huge spectrum of opinion. You're never going to agree with everyone. People are going to have different views, and we just have to live with it. And I think, since I've been involved in this area, I've seen lots of infighting between different groups, and it's just not helpful. We just have to accept there are some areas we can coalesce and agree, some areas we can't, and we go our own separate ways and have our separate campaigns. But I think it's really important that we just actually are kind to ourselves and to one another, because we're working in a difficult area as well. So that's all I can add.
Great, thank you. And I think there are still a few more questions, but in the interest of not letting this event go on too far past the hour, I think we'll make this the last question. There was a couple of questions relating to the idea of actually securing practical experience. And I assume people are talking about things like internships and volunteering and that sort of thing. If people have any recommendations, I know, Paula, you've already mentioned some of the various things that ALAW provides and the support it offers. Does anybody have anything to add in terms of actually gaining those concrete experiences that will help people land relevant roles and be excellent candidates for helping animals in the small number of available positions that we've said there sometimes are?
I think Iain mentioned earlier for his chambers that if someone has some voluntary experience, for example, that actually demonstrates their passion and interest. And I'd really echo that. Before I switched from working in NGOs on human rights issues to animals, whilst doing that other stuff, I was working in a shelter with cats and literally just volunteering my time whenever I could, just because I love animals and I wanted to be with them in any which way. But when that did come to making that switch, it was evident that it was real, that I did care. But about gaining more concrete experience, I get a lot of messages at the moment. I think it's a really hard job market on LinkedIn, people asking, are there any opportunities coming up in your team, things like this. It's really hard. There aren't always many junior roles in the exact area of work that you want to be in. But quite often, if you just get in any role, actually, that's a really good starting point as well. And you can move departments and showcase your skill set.
Yeah.
Jamie, do you mind if I just jump in? Because I've just picked up the chat feed on the side, and there are a couple of interesting questions that I feel I ought to address before we all part company, the first of which is from Catherine and the second of which is from Danielle. And to take them in order, Catherine's question being, I applied for pupillage at a public and environmental chambers. I was told not to include my advocacy experience with animal rebellion because it would be off-putting to the QCs. Do you know if this is common amongst most sets? Well, it certainly isn't the case for One Crown Office Row, and I can say that as head of recruitment. I think in those circumstances, it would hold you in pretty good stead, and it would certainly be an interesting thing to talk about for 5 or 10 minutes, rather than just, you know, telling us all how you're fabulously interested in clinical negligence law and you think assets the best in the world and all the rest of it. It's something that's potentially separates you from the crowd, so I think it's a good thing. I don't think it's particularly common amongst most sets, certainly not sort of top 20 sets. As to Danielle's question, which was, I should quote in full, Iain, as a Nazi vegan terrorist, do you ever find any personal challenges in representing the RSPCA when they approve some of the animal agri practices that you speak of? Or do you find that essentially it's better to focus on the greater good? Well, you've answered the question with the last point. You know, us barristers take, in accordance with the cab rank rule, the instructions that, as long as they're within our competence, we are, you know, instructed to act in relation to. One thing I would say about this sort of area of law, though, is when you're involved in animal welfare, certainly if you prosecute or you do JRs that really have animal welfare at the forefront, you're coming as close to frequently fighting the good fight as I think you can do as an independent barrister. Because let's say, take the contrast of just doing general crime. You never really know. You think you know, we all think we know, we all think we can tell whether someone's lying, but you never really know whether the complainant is making it up. Animals don't make it up. As a matter of fact, they've either been caused objectively to suffer, which is to say they've fallen below that minimum standard that applies in our country, or not. And on that basis, a lot of the anxiety that one can often feel about just representing the bad guys tends not to rear its ugly head when, you know, you're working in this sort of area of the law. So in terms of the RSPCA, I disagree with a number of their policies, as a matter of fact, I really do. But as a general point of principle, you know, I like the fact that they're pretty, you know, vociferous in their defence of animal welfare.
Great, thank you, Iain. Yeah, so I guess we'll wrap up. Do any of the other speakers, or yeah, Paula or Sonul, have anything to add, and any final words?
No, thank you.
Cool. Sonul, anything to add?
No.
Can I ask a question, one last, or not?
No, just quickly, yeah.
Okay, it's nothing to do with the career. It's just recently I've been dog walking to my neighbors, and in the park, when I throw a ball, dog was trying to get the ball, and also another person was trying to get the ball. They crashed on the air. In the end, she ended up having 2 plates on her knee, and now she's going to sue me. But I don't have any insurance, and dog owner doesn't have any insurance. But it was just a really freak accident. It was nothing to do with, you know, any kind of bad intention. I'm a law graduate, but I don't do law anymore. I just work in court as an interpreter, self-employed. So in this aspect, am I sort of, am I in the wrong not to have any insurance, even though I was a volunteer?
I think there are dog law specialist firms. You're probably best off just directly
Asking them.
asking them. I think so. But thank you, everyone. It's been amazing to see so many people. And thank you to our speakers for giving up their time and sharing their career experiences very honestly with us. It's been really amazing. Thank you.
Thank you to you.
Thank
Hi,
you.
everyone.
Thank you, Paula. Thanks to the speakers. Thanks to all attendees. Great event. Bye then.
Thanks. Take care.
Thanks.
Okay.